I told you we'd go to a lot of verses. 2 Samuel 23, listen to, this verse is going to teach us. David poured out his life as an irrecoverable offering because he believed God deserved the best. Now, to give you a background for this 2 Samuel 23 passage, once David longed for the sweet water he had drank as a child from the well of Bethlehem, and it was behind enemy lines, and that's where we are in verse 13. He was with his 30 chief men. At the harvest time, they came to David at the cave of Adullam. A troop of Philistines had encamped in the valley of Rephaim, and David was in the stronghold. And verse 14, and the Philistines were in Bethlehem. They were in his hometown. So bad times had come. The enemies, probably because of David's victories, had come into his hometown, probably looking for his family. We know already David had sent him off to the king of Moab to protect him. And so the Philistines were late, but they came in and occupied his hometown. And one time David was standing there leaning on his sword, and he says, the water used to be so good in the well of Bethlehem. And look what happens. Verse 15, he said that with longing, and oh, that someone would give me a drink of the water from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate. I mean, he even says exactly where it is. Verse 16, so 3 mighty men of his 30, the 3 mightiest, broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. And they thought he would just guzzle it down, and just dump it all over himself, drink it, and wet himself all over and get all refreshed from the battle. And what did he do with this precious cold water? I love this. Verse 16 in the middle, he wouldn't drink it, but he poured it out to the Lord. You know what that's called in Mosaic legislation? A drink offering. They would bring their offerings liquid, and they would pour it out onto the floor of the tabernacle out in the desert, and it would go right into the sand. They just poured on the sand, it was gone. Just a drink offering was poured out. Sometimes they would pour it over the offerings, but most often the drink offering was just poured out before the Lord, irrecoverably. A drink offering poured out was never recoverable, as the ground absorbed every drop. So David gave to the Lord irrecoverably what was most precious to him. David poured out the water from the well of his childhood, just like the treasures of his career were poured out, because David believed God deserved the best of his time, his treasures, his talents. Do you see what made him a servant? He loved to irrecoverably give stuff to God, what he couldn't get back. Some people say, okay, Lord, you heard the story of the farmer who dedicated a cow to the Lord, and he was gone and late for supper, and his wife came, and she said, why were you late? And he said, the Lord's cow died. See, he gave one cow to the Lord, and the one that died, he named as the Lord's, right? And he was there trying to nurse it back to health. That's what we usually do. We give something to the Lord, and if things go bad, we take it back. The Lord's gift died. The Lord's cow died. David didn't. He just gave it to the Lord and wouldn't take it back. It was poured out irrecoverably because he believed God deserved the best. Remember, I told you last time that 2 individuals that called themselves under-rowers, these bottom-level galley slaves, were the Apostle Paul in the New Testament and David in Acts 13. They're both called the very great lifelong servants to God. Did you know both of them were characterized by this pouring out to the Lord? You remember what David said at the end of his life? He says, the time of my departure has come, and I have been poured out like a drink offering. David poured out his life, and Paul in the New Testament, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6, said his life is poured out like a drink offering to God. You know what that means? Irrecoverably given. That was a characteristic of David's life. There's one more. Turn to chapter 24 of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 24. Here's another one. David not only poured out his life as an irrecoverable offering because he believed God deserved the best, but in 2 Samuel 24, starting in verse 18, David made sacrifices to God because he knew God deserved that which was costly. You see, he prefigures all the beautiful things in the New Testament. Do you remember why we remember the woman that broke her alabaster flask and poured it out on Christ's feet to prepare him, to anoint him for his death? What do we remember about that? She broke the alabaster and poured it out. She couldn't collect it back. She broke the bottle and poured it out. She couldn't get it back. And Jesus said that will always be spoken of. Do you remember the widow that brought the 2 little onion skin leptons and put them in the treasury? And Jesus pointed to that act and said she gave what cost her greatly. You see, that matters to God. And that's what was the heartbeat of His servant David. Look at 2 Samuel 24. And Gad came to David and said to him in verse 18, "Go up and erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." Now this was to stop the judgment of God. There was this plague because of David's incitement by the devil to number the people, and he numbered and found out he had one of the biggest armies in the world, and God didn't like that, and He sent 3 days of plague, and the death angel was hovering over Jerusalem, and God wanted David to go up on Mount Moriah and offer an offering to stop the plague. And that's where we pick up. And Gad, the prophet, came to David and said, "Go up and erect an altar." Verse 19, so David went according to the word of God and went up as the Lord commanded. And you know what happens in verses 20 and 21 and 22? This well-meaning Araunah the Jebusite, which means he was not a Jew, he was a Canaanite descendant, comes up and says, "Hey, I'll just provide the oxen and the gear and the wood, and you can just use all my stuff and just make your offering and stop the death angel." And look what David says in verse 24. The king said to Araunah, "No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price," actually for full cost. He offered him full price for the stuff. The land, the oxen, the yoke, everything. Why? "Nor will I offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God with that which costs me nothing." That is a deep-seated principle of God's servant David's life. The prophet Gad told David what God expected, a sacrificial offering on Mount Moriah. David went to the spot, and the owner offered to give David everything he needed, and David would not take the threshing floor and the oxen and the instruments without paying full price, because David would not give to God what cost him nothing. Not only did he give stuff irrecoverably, but he gave things that were very dear to him, that cost him, that meant he sacrificed. At the end of his life, what did David do with all of his treasures? As we read at the beginning in 1 Chronicles 22, he says, "I've prepared all these for the Lord." Well, I wonder, are you living like a servant of God? What's your legacy? We should all think about that frequently. You say, "I want to have a legacy of being God's servant. How do I start?" Well, here's a quick game plan. Choose to be like David. Number 1, like David, God's servant, say, "My life was designed uniquely by you, O God." Number 2, my life needs to be disciplined. Number 3, my life needs to be available and I offer it to you. My life will only amount to something if I'm empowered by you. I want to be an example of your godliness. I want to live in true humility. I want to minister to others. I want to honor God with my work and my habits and my life. And when I get to talk about myself, I want to magnify God's hand in my life. And I want to honor God's name with my own mouth. I want to dedicate all my treasures and trophies to the Lord. And like David, when I give something to the Lord, I want to give it irrecoverably and sacrificially.